They were here before us. Not in the way that most animals were here before us, passively occupying a landscape that humans would eventually reach and reshape. Wolves were here in a different sense. They hunted the same prey we hunted. They lived in cooperative family groups the way we lived in cooperative family groups. They read landscape and wind and the behavior of other animals with an intelligence that early humans would have recognized, across the species divide, as something close to their own. And then, somewhere in the deep past, the relationship between our two species changed in a way that no other predator-to-predator relationship in the history of life on Earth has ever changed. For a long time, we thought we understood how that happened. We had a story of wolves approaching human campsites, of bolder individuals being tolerated and eventually integrated, of a slow transformation from wild apex predator to domestic companion. The story of dog domestication seemed to be, at its core, the story of wolves becoming something else. But ancient DNA has recently revealed something that undermines that entire framing. Because the question of how wolves became dogs turns out to be inseparable from a deeper, stranger question, one that researchers did not fully anticipate. What happened to the wolves that did not become dogs? Where did modern wolves actually come from? And why does the genome of every living wolf on Earth today carry signals that do not fit the map we thought we had drawn? The wolf's own origin story, it turns out, has been hiding in plain sight. And it is far more complicated than anyone expected. The accepted picture of wolf evolutionary history was built across the 20th century through a combination of fossil records, morphological analysis, and, eventually, early genetic studies. The gray wolf, Canis lupus, was understood to have evolved in Eurasia from earlier canid ancestors and to have spread across the northern hemisphere through a series of range expansions facilitated by the land bridges and habitat connectivity of the Pleistocene epoch. At its peak, the wolf was the most widely distributed large land predator on Earth, ranging from the Arctic tundra to the Arabian Peninsula, from the forests of Western Europe to the mountains of Central Asia, and across the Bering Land Bridge into North America, where its descendants eventually diversified into the wolves and coyotes of the New World. Genetic studies in the late 1990s and early 2000s confirmed the broad outline. The gray wolf showed substantial genetic diversity across its range, consistent with a long evolutionary history and wide geographic spread. Studies of mitochondrial DNA identified multiple distinct lineages within the species, corresponding roughly to different geographic populations: European wolves, Middle Eastern wolves, Indian wolves, North American wolves, each shaped by thousands of years of regional adaptation and periodic isolation. The picture was complex in its details but coherent in its broad shape. Wolves had spread from Eurasia, diversified across their range, and persisted, more or less in their original form, into the present, except in regions where human persecution had driven local extinctions. The wolf was old. The wolf was successful. The wolf was understood. Then ancient DNA complicated everything. The first anomaly had been present in the fossil record for decades, but its significance had not been fully appreciated. Across Europe and Asia, the Pleistocene epoch, the Great Ice Age that lasted from roughly 2.5 million years ago until about 12,000 years ago, had been home to wolves that were, in many respects, different from modern wolves. Larger, in some cases, with different skull proportions, different dental morphology, different apparent ecological roles. Some of these ancient wolves, researchers had assumed, were simply ancestral to the modern wolves that replaced them as the Pleistocene ended and the Holocene began. A matter of gradual evolution, of populations shifting as the climate warmed, the megafauna collapsed, and the landscape reorganized itself. The modern wolf was the refined descendant of those ancient forms. But that assumption was never rigorously tested with genetic data. Ancient bones could tell you shape and size. They could tell you something about diet. What they could not tell you, without DNA, was whether an ancient wolf and a modern wolf shared a direct ancestral relationship, or whether they were something more complicated. Parallel lineages. Competitors. Populations that had replaced each other rather than transformed into each other. The genetic tools to answer that question did not exist until recently. When they arrived, the answer was not what the fossil record had seemed to promise. Ancient DNA research on wolves began in earnest during the 2010s, propelled by the same technological advances that were transforming the study of human prehistory, horse domestication, and ancient cattle populations. Permafrost sites across Siberia, Alaska, and the Yukon preserved wolf specimens of extraordinary age in exceptional condition, bones and teeth from animals that had died tens of thousands of years ago, their genetic material locked inside by the cold as thoroughly as any modern freezer. Whole genome sequencing allowed researchers to read the complete genetic archive of those ancient specimens and compare them against the genomes of modern wolves from across the species' current range. Mitochondrial DNA provided the maternal ancestry line. Nuclear DNA provided the full picture of ancestry from both parents, capturing admixture events, population replacements, and the complex signals of lineages that had merged, split, and merged again over thousands of years. What emerged from those comparisons was a picture that no one had fully predicted. The ancient wolves of the Pleistocene were not simply the ancestors of modern wolves. They were, in many cases, members of distinct lineages, genetic populations that had occupied Eurasia and North America for tens of thousands of years and had then, at the end of the Pleistocene, largely or entirely disappeared. Modern wolves were not their direct descendants. Modern wolves were something newer, a replacement population, a lineage that had spread across the northern hemisphere in the wake of the megafauna extinctions and the climatic upheavals of the late Pleistocene, filling the ecological space left by the collapse of the earlier wolf populations. The wolf that exists today is not as ancient as we thought. If this kind of discovery, the kind that replaces stability with strangeness, is what draws you to science and history, subscribe. Because what comes next is stranger still. The conflict that deepened as more ancient genomes were analyzed was not simply about age. It was about identity, about which modern wolf populations were most directly connected to which ancient lineages, and what that connectivity revealed about the wolf's path through the most dramatic environmental upheaval of the past 100,000 years. The data began to reveal a pattern of profound discontinuity. The ancient wolf lineages that had dominated Eurasia during the height of the last ice age, robust, large-bodied wolves adapted to hunting megafauna in periglacial environments, showed surprisingly weak genetic connections to the wolves that occupied the same territories after the Pleistocene ended. In some regions, the genetic signal of the ancient population was essentially absent from modern wolves. The turnover had been close to complete, but not everywhere, and not uniformly. Some modern wolf populations carried stronger signals of ancient ancestry than others. The picture was not a clean replacement but a mosaic, patches of continuity within a broader landscape of turnover, ancient signals persisting in some lineages while being erased in others, ghost populations whose genetic contribution appeared in unexpected places and at unexpected frequencies. The story did not collapse. It widened into something that demanded new frameworks to explain. 3 interpretive frameworks have emerged from the ancient DNA evidence, and each captures something real about what the genomes are showing. The first proposes that the transition from Pleistocene to Holocene wolves involved a genuine population replacement, a demographic event in which the ancient wolf lineages were drastically reduced or eliminated by the same pressures that drove the megafauna extinctions, and were subsequently replaced by the expansion of surviving wolf populations from glacial refugia, places where smaller groups had persisted through the worst of the climatic extremes and then re-expanded as conditions improved. Under this model, modern wolves are the descendants of those surviving refuge populations, and the discontinuity with ancient wolves reflects the near-extinction and recovery dynamics that characterized many large mammal species at the end of the Pleistocene. The second framework emphasizes admixture, the possibility that modern wolves are not replacements for the ancient lineages but genetic hybrids, descended in part from the ancient populations and in part from later expanding lineages that mixed with ancient survivors. Under this model, the ancient signal is not absent from modern wolves. It is diluted, blended into a mixed population that carries ancestry from both old and new sources. The apparent discontinuity is partly an artifact of how dramatically the ancient signal has been diluted by subsequent admixture. The third framework, and the most structurally interesting, proposes that the wolf's evolutionary history has been cyclically disrupted, that the species has experienced multiple episodes of population contraction, replacement, and admixture across its long history, with each glacial cycle producing new bottlenecks, new expansions, and new mixing events that repeatedly reshuffled the genetic architecture of the species. Under this model, the Pleistocene-Holocene transition is not a unique event but the most recent instance of a recurring pattern, and the modern wolf's genome carries layered signals from multiple such cycles. None of these frameworks is fully settled. Each has supporters, and the ancient DNA dataset continues to grow. The study that most forcefully reoriented the field was a large-scale ancient wolf genome analysis that brought together specimens spanning more than 100,000 years, from the depths of the last glacial maximum through the Pleistocene-Holocene transition and into the historical period. The geographic range of the specimens was exceptional, covering sites from Western Europe to Siberia to North America, allowing researchers to map genetic change not just through time but across space simultaneously. The central finding was that the late Pleistocene wolf populations of Europe and much of Asia showed genetic profiles that were substantially distinct from modern wolves in the same regions. The divergence was not gradual, not the kind of slow drift that characterizes populations evolving in place over tens of thousands of years. It had the sharper signature of demographic disruption: populations that shrank, populations that went extinct, and populations that expanded into vacated ranges, carrying a newer genetic profile into territories the ancient wolves had once occupied. But the study also found something that challenged the simplest version of the replacement model. In the ancient DNA from wolf specimens dating to the period just before and during the domestication of dogs, roughly 15 to 30,000 years ago, there were signals that connected certain ancient wolf populations to the founding ancestors of domestic dogs in ways that were not reflected in the modern wolf lineages of the same regions. The wolves that were most closely related to the ancestors of dogs were not the same wolves that gave rise to the modern wolves of Europe or Asia. The implication was striking. The wolf population that gave rise to the domestic dog may itself have subsequently declined or disappeared, leaving its primary legacy not in the modern wolf but in every domestic dog alive today. The founding population of the most successful domesticated animal in human history may have been a lineage of wolves that otherwise vanished from the wild. Not the wolves researchers expected. Not even the lineage that survived. The deepest twist in the wolf's genomic story is what it reveals about survival and legacy. Modern wolves, the ones that still range across the boreal forests of Canada, the tundra of Siberia, the mountains of Central Asia, are not the ancient wolves that hunted alongside early humans across the Pleistocene landscape. They are newcomers on a geological timescale. Survivors of a collapse. The inheritors of a world that had been reorganized by climate, by extinction, and by the transformation of prey communities that followed the end of the Ice Age. The ancient wolves, the ones with the deepest evolutionary roots, the ones that hunted alongside woolly mammoths and alongside the earliest anatomically modern humans in Eurasia, left their most enduring mark not in the wild but in the animals sleeping on our floors, riding in our cars, watching our faces for the signals we learned to read each other through across 50,000 years of shared history. The genome of the dog preserved what the wild could not. Picture a high valley in Siberia, perhaps 30,000 years ago. The sky is enormous and white with cold. Spruce trees stand at the lower margins of the slope, dark against the snow. A river has frozen into silence somewhere below. And on the open ground above the treeline, a pack of wolves moves through a landscape that is both alien and recognizable. The same mountains, the same weather logic, the same ecological rhythms, but populated with animals that no living human has ever seen. Woolly rhinoceros at the far edge of the valley. Bison heavier than any modern breed. And in the middle distance, the dim shapes of a human hunting party, moving slowly against the wind. The wolves watch. The humans watch back. This is not yet the story of dogs. It is earlier than that. This is the story of two intelligent predator species occupying the same landscape, watching each other across a distance measured in caution and curiosity, each learning the other's patterns without yet knowing what that knowledge will eventually become. The wolves of that valley are genetically gone now. Their lineage did not survive the upheavals that followed. But something of what happened in that valley, some behavioral inheritance, some mutual recognition encoded not in DNA but in the long memory of two species learning to tolerate each other, carried forward into the transformation that would follow. The genome preserved the biology. The behavior preserved something else. The origin of the wolf, as a species, as a lineage, as the ancestor of the most complex interspecies relationship in the history of life, is not what we thought it was. Modern wolves are younger than the ancient wolves they replaced. The wolf population most closely connected to our own history, the one whose descendants became the animal we call the domestic dog, is largely gone from the wild. And the wolves that still run through the forests and tundra of the northern hemisphere today carry a genome that is, in ways we are still working to understand, newer and more fragile than its ancient predecessors. This is not a story of stability and persistence. It is a story of loss and replacement and survival through bottleneck, of a species that has, multiple times across its history, been reduced to remnants and then expanded again, carrying forward only a fraction of what came before. And it is a story that is, in its deep structure, inseparable from our own. Because the same climatic forces that disrupted wolf populations at the end of the Pleistocene disrupted human populations too. The same megafaunal collapse that removed the wolf's primary prey transformed the human hunting economy. The same landscape reorganization that created the vacuums the new wolf lineages expanded into created the new ecological contexts in which human and wolf populations came into closer contact than before. The wolf's genome and the human genome were being shaped by the same world, at the same time. And somewhere in that reshaping, the most consequential interspecies encounter in the history of either species took place, leaving its trace in every dog that has ever lived, and in the genomes of wolves that, for the most part, no longer exist. The old story said the wolf became the dog. The genome says something more precise and more haunting. A particular kind of wolf became the dog. And the world that made that particular kind of wolf has been gone for 20,000 years. Subscribe if you want more stories where the ancient archive reveals what we were too certain to look for, because the deep past is still full of answers we haven't learned to ask for yet.